They were his human wall, the living, breathing fortress that stood between Elvis Presley and a world that wanted to devour him. They were the Memphis Mafia, brothers forged not in blood, but in the white-hot crucible of global fame. They took the punches. They deflected the fanatics. They swore they would take a bullet for the man they called king. But in the summer of 1977, they aimed a weapon of their own. A weapon far more lethal than any bullet. A weapon made of paper and ink, loaded with secrets that would publicly execute the myth of Elvis Presley. This is the story of how the king's most loyal soldiers became the architects of his crucifixion. How the men paid to protect his life ended up writing the very story of his death. To understand the betrayal, you must first understand the bond. It was absolute. For nearly 2 decades, Red West and his cousin Sonny were more than employees. They were Elvis's shadows, his confidants, his sparring partners. They were there before the screaming crowds, before the gold records, before Graceland became a palace. They were family. Dave Hebler, a karate black belt, was a later addition, but no less a part of the inner sanctum. Their job description was simple: protect the king at all costs. From the obsessive fans, from the threats, from the press, they saw everything. They heard everything. They kept every secret. They were the keepers of the keys to the kingdom, privy to the man behind the rhinestone curtain. They saw his generosity, a force of nature that could change a stranger's life with the gift of a new Cadillac. They saw his insecurities, the deep-seated fear of a poor boy from Tupelo who never believed he was worthy of the crown. They saw the loneliness that stalked him in the gilded cage of his own fame. And they saw the darkness. The darkness was a creeping fog, rolling in slowly at first, then all at once. By 1976, the king was a shadow of his former self. The electrifying energy that had ripped through the fabric of American culture was fading, smothered by a mountain of prescription pills. His nights were sleepless odysseys fueled by uppers. His days were a sluggish nightmare navigated with downers. The once lethal karate moves became clumsy, dangerous pantomimes on stage. The voice, that primal force of nature, became a strained echo. The men who protected him watched in silent horror. They were tasked with shielding his body, but they were powerless to save his soul. They became enablers, sent on late-night journeys to procure prescriptions from compliant doctors. They became janitors of his rage, cleaning up the aftermath of violent mood swings that saw hotel rooms destroyed and relationships shattered. Loyalty had a price, and that price was their silence, their complicity. But that loyalty, stretched thin over years of excess and decay, was about to snap. On July 13, 1976, the world tilted on its axis. The shield was not broken by an outsider. It was shattered by the king himself, or rather, by his father. A single, cold phone call from Vernon Presley to Red, Sonny, and Dave. Their services were no longer required. No explanation, no goodbye from Elvis. After a combined 38 years of service, they were cast out, excommunicated. It wasn't just a job, it was their entire identity, vaporized in a single, brutal phone call. The brotherhood was broken, and from the ashes of that broken loyalty, a cold, hard fury began to burn. 3 minutes have passed. The viewer is hooked by the betrayal. Now, the rehook. They were adrift, stripped of the 6-figure salaries, the private jets, the reflected glory of the king. Red West, the tough guy actor and songwriter who had been with Elvis since high school, was suddenly just another out-of-work stuntman. Sonny West, the loyal cousin, found himself struggling to support his family. Dave Hebler, the karate expert, lost his prestigious position overnight. They were outside the gates of Graceland, looking in. The silence from Elvis was deafening. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any financial hardship. He hadn't even had the courage to fire them himself. Into this vacuum of anger and desperation stepped a man named Steve Dunleavy. Dunleavy was not a friend. He was a journalistic shark, a notorious Australian reporter for the tabloid The National Star. He smelled a story. He smelled money. And most of all, he smelled revenge. He reached out to the fired bodyguards with a proposition. Tell your story. Tell the real story. The meetings were clandestine, held in secret, thick with paranoia. Were they doing the right thing? This wasn't just breaking a code of silence. It was heresy. It was burning down the church they had helped build. Dunleavy pressed them, framing the narrative not as a bitter tell-all, but as an act of love. A desperate intervention. A shock treatment, he called it, to force Elvis to see the truth of his own self-destruction. It was the perfect rationalization. They weren't traitors, they told themselves. They were saviors. They were the only ones who truly knew how close to the edge he was. The remaining members of the Memphis Mafia were yes men, too terrified of losing their paychecks to confront the king. But they, the outcasts, they could sound the alarm. They could hold up a mirror to their fallen idol, no matter how ugly the reflection. Was it for revenge? For the $1 million book deal? Or was it a last, desperate attempt to save the man they still, in some fractured way, loved? The line blurred until it disappeared completely. The decision was made. They would talk. They would tell Dunleavy everything. The floodgates of 2 decades of secrets were about to be thrown open, but they had no idea of the sheer power of the narrative they were about to unleash, or how the street-smart reporter sitting across from them would meticulously forge their memories into the most devastating weapon of all. The process was an exorcism. For weeks, in hotel rooms and over crackling phone lines, the stories poured out of them. A torrent of suppressed memories and guarded secrets, now expertly shaped by Dunleavy's sensationalist flair. He wasn't just a reporter. He was a master storyteller, and he knew he was sitting on the story of a lifetime. They told him about the drugs, not rumors, but specifics. The Dilaudid, the Demerol, the Percodan, the Quaaludes, the intricate dance of doctors and pharmacies. The packs prepared for Elvis before every show, a pharmaceutical cocktail, just to get him on stage. They described the night he nearly overdosed in a Las Vegas hotel, only to be revived and pushed back into the spotlight. They told him about the paranoia, the belief that contract killers were after him, the bizarre obsession with collecting police badges, as if a piece of tin could grant him immunity from the world. The television sets shot out in fits of rage when a performer he disliked, like Robert Goulet, appeared on screen. They told him about the spiritual quest that bordered on madness, the day he believed he saw a face of Jesus in a cloud formation and ordered the car to a halt in the middle of the desert. The obsession with the book, The Impersonal Life, which he would read aloud for hours to anyone trapped in the room with him, convinced he was a divine messenger. Each story, meticulously documented by Dunleavy, chipped away another piece of the marble idol, revealing the deeply flawed, terrified, and volatile man beneath. For the bodyguards, it was a painful, cathartic, and terrifying process. They were betraying the omerta, the sacred code of the Memphis Mafia. They were laying their brother bare for the world to see. Dunleavy, however, had no such qualms. He saw the narrative arc, the perfect tragedy of a fallen god. He hammered their raw, emotional accounts into a shocking, page-turning thriller. The book was given a title, a question that hung in the air like a death sentence. Elvis. What happened? A publisher, Ballantine Books, snapped it up. The release date was set for August 1977. The time bomb was now ticking, ready to detonate in the heart of the Elvis Presley empire. And back at Graceland, the king, cocooned in his world of velvet and denial, had no idea the apocalypse was coming. Another rehook is needed. The book is ready. Now, shift to Elvis's reaction. News travels fast in a kingdom built on whispers. The first rumors of the book reached Elvis like a distant storm. He dismissed them. It was unthinkable. Red? Sonny? His boys? They wouldn't. They couldn't. He saw it as a cheap shakedown, a desperate ploy for money from disgruntled former employees. He had dealt with this before. Money could solve anything. Money had always solved everything. He made attempts to stop it. He dispatched emissaries, offering the men tens of thousands of dollars to kill the book. "Tell them I'll give them whatever they want," he allegedly told his inner circle. He believed their silence was a commodity he could purchase, just as he had purchased their loyalty for years with cars, houses, and jewels. It was a fatal miscalculation. He failed to understand the depth of their wounded pride. This was no longer about money. It was about validation. It was about being heard. The offers were refused. The publisher, smelling a bestseller, refused to be bought. The machinery was in motion, and it could not be stopped. The reality of the book began to seep through the cracks of Elvis's carefully constructed denial. The phantom that haunted his periphery was becoming a real, tangible monster. His paranoia, already simmering from years of drug abuse, boiled over. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He trusted no one. The book became a symbol of his ultimate fear. Not death, but exposure. The fear that the world would finally see him not as a king, but as the scared little boy from Tupelo, hiding behind a mask. Then, the unthinkable happened. Sometime in late July, a representative from the publisher, seeking to brace Elvis for the impact, or perhaps as a final, cruel twist of the knife, sent an advance copy of the book directly to Graceland. The betrayal was no longer a rumor. It was no longer a threat. It was 300 pages of his darkest secrets, bound in paperback, sitting in his hands. He began to read, and the world he had built around himself, the fantasy he had lived in for 20 years, began to crumble into dust. The impact was a Category 5 hurricane hitting a house of cards. The book was released on August 1, 1977, just 2 weeks before his final tour was set to begin. The press erupted. It was a global sensation. Every damning detail, every humiliating secret was splashed across newspapers and broadcasts on television screens around the world. The carefully manicured image of Elvis Presley, the wholesome, God-fearing American icon, was systematically and brutally dismantled. Back at Graceland, Elvis was a man besieged. He was devastated. He was humiliated. But most of all, he was consumed by a white-hot, powerless rage. He would lock himself away for hours, poring over the pages, his disbelief curdling into fury. How could they? How could they write about the time he flew into a demerol-fueled rage and nearly shot his own doctor? How could they describe his secret obsession with mortuary science, his strange visits to funeral homes to study embalming techniques? These weren't stories told by strangers. These were secrets shared with brothers. He felt the sting of every word. Sonny West writing about his ballooning weight and struggles with diet. Red West describing his near-fatal overdoses. Dave Hebler detailing the arsenal of weapons he kept and his increasingly volatile temper. They had documented his every failure, every weakness, every private moment of despair. They had turned his life into a cheap, sensationalist spectacle. His manager, the shrewd and calculating Colonel Tom Parker, tried to mount a counteroffensive. He issued statements dismissing the authors as a bunch of disgruntled guys trying to make a quick buck. He told the press and the fans to ignore it, to treat it as the fiction it was. He tried to spin the narrative, to protect the multi-million-dollar brand he had so carefully constructed. But it was too late. The truth, or at least this version of it, was out. The genie could not be put back in the bottle. The damage was absolute. The king had been dethroned, not by a rival, not by a changing musical landscape, but by the men who once stood guard at the foot of his throne. He was naked before the world, stripped of his myth, his dignity, his privacy. In his private chambers at Graceland, surrounded by the gold records and accolades of a life that now felt like a lie, the weight of this public crucifixion became a physical, crushing burden. The book was not just on the bookshelves, it was inside his head. In the final 2 weeks of his life, it became a suffocating obsession. He couldn't escape it. He brought it up constantly with his remaining entourage, a toxic loop of anger and hurt. He would read passages aloud, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He saw betrayal in every sentence. He was a man cornered. The upcoming tour, set to begin on August 17th, became his singular focus. It was no longer just a series of concerts. It was his chance for rebuttal. He planned to take the stage and address the book, to tell his side of the story, to expose the authors as liars and traitors. He would reclaim his narrative. He would show the world that the king was not dead. But the psychological pressure was astronomical. The public humiliation, layered on top of the physical agony of his deteriorating health, created a perfect storm. His body, ravaged by years of prescription drug abuse, was already failing. His heart was enlarged, his colon diseased, his liver damaged. He was a walking medical disaster, held together by a fragile web of pharmaceuticals and sheer willpower. The book was the final, devastating blow to his spirit, the one part of him that had always seemed indestructible. He tried to find moments of normalcy. He spent time with his daughter, Lisa Marie. He played the piano. He made plans for the future. On the night of August 15th, he even played a game of racquetball with his cousins, trying to sweat out the poisons, both chemical and emotional. He was trying to fight. He was trying to prove he was still Elvis. In the early hours of August 16th, after a late-night visit to his dentist, he retreated to the sanctuary of his master bathroom. It was his private kingdom within the kingdom, the one place he could truly be alone. He took a copy of a book with him to read, not the one that was tormenting him, but another book about spiritualism. He was a man running from a truth he could no longer outrun, seeking solace in a world beyond this one. Did the book kill him? Was the shame, the stress, the all-consuming rage the final trigger that pushed his ravaged heart past its breaking point? The world would debate this question for decades. But as the sun rose over Memphis on the morning of August 16, 1977, the debate would become tragically irrelevant. The king was gone. The news of Elvis Presley's death hit the world like a shockwave. And, in an instant, the narrative surrounding Elvis, what happened, was irrevocably transformed. It was no longer a scandalous, bitter tell-all from fired employees. It was prophecy. Overnight, the book became a macabre bestseller. Sales exploded from thousands into the millions. It was rebranded, no longer an attack but an explanation. It became the Rosetta Stone for a grief-stricken public, desperate to understand how their immortal idol could have died so young, so tragically. The author's words, once seen as treason, were now viewed as a desperate, Cassandra-like warning that had gone unheeded. For Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, the world had turned upside down. They had been thrust into a bizarre and horrifying new reality. They were vindicated and condemned in the same breath. They went on television, their faces etched with a complex mixture of grief and defensiveness, repeating their mantra, "They did it to save him." It was a shock treatment that came too late. They wanted to expose the yes men who were killing him, to force him to get help. But to the legion of Elvis fans, and even to many within their own circle, the explanation rang hollow. The timing was too perfect, the payday too large. They were forever branded with the mark of Judas, the men who sold out their king for 30 pieces of silver, or, in this case, a 7-figure book deal. They would live the rest of their lives in the long, dark shadow of that book, and the death of the man they once called a brother. They faced public scorn, alienation from friends, and the crushing weight of their own what-ifs. What if they hadn't written the book? What if he had listened? What if he had lived? These were questions that would haunt their sleep for the rest of their days. They had wanted to set the record straight, but they had instead authored the final, tragic chapter of a legend. In the end, the story of Elvis, What Happened, is a profound American tragedy. A story of love, loyalty, and the corrosive nature of fame. A story of how 3 men, in a desperate act of either revenge or rescue, held up a mirror to a king who could not bear to see his own reflection. They swore an oath to protect his life, but by exposing his secrets, they became the unwilling narrators of his death, forever sealing his story not as a flawless god on a pedestal, but as a broken, beautiful, and profoundly human king. If you were captivated by this hidden story from the life of the king, be sure to subscribe to Forever Elvis Stories. Click the bell icon so you never miss a new chapter into the heart of the